Sí, sí, sí.
Bueno, vamos a empezar. Can I start? Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. Let me introduce myself. My name is Senen Barro, and I am the scientific director of the CiTIUS, of this research center, where we are at this moment. Some people face to face, and the rest, most of them online. Well, on behalf of this research center, and on behalf of the organizers of this event, I would like to thank all the participants for the interest you have shown in it. This event, as you probably know, is organized by CiTIUS. We are one of the research centers of the region of Galicia, with considered as a research center with a high potential by our regional government, and the CiTIUS is the organizer, but sponsored by Microsoft, and with the collaboration of two ITNs, two innovative training networks. One is No Bias, and the other one is Natural Language for Explainable AI. In this case, an ITN of which CiTIUS is the coordinating node in Europe. Well, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Microsoft for their sponsorship. It's really important for us. And I would also like to thank Gabriel personally for the interest he always shown in our initiatives. In fact, this was the case close to 1 year ago with the organization of the European Conference on Artificial Intelligence, ECAI 2020, held in Santiago de Compostela. Well, held in the cloud, in internet, but anyway, in some sense in Santiago de Compostela last summer. And I have very good news for you, Gabriel, because you will have the chance to help us again, because we will organize a CAI in 2024, hopefully in a face-to-face format then. And the floor is yours, Gabriel.
And then thank you very much for your very kind words, and of course we would look forward for that future event. But first of all, well, hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today and at this European AI Regulation Week. I must say that I'm super excited for the events that are forthcoming. We have a great set of panelists. We will be listening and learning about the responsible use of AI. But before digging into that, when I was reflecting about how much we have collaborated with the University of Santiago Compostela, with CiTIUS, and with Professor Senen Barro, well, many things have come to my mind. And one of the key things is that we will be defined, our generation will be defined by the challenges that we are facing. And in many cases, those challenges, they are very complex. In some cases, they are even existential for us globally. And the questions that we have as a company, as a technological company, Microsoft, is what is the role of the technology in all this discussion on how we can overcome all these challenges? How can we help institutions? How can we help states, governments, enterprises in achieving their best goals? In basically, how can we empower them in achieving more? And the questions that are relative to all, let's say, this development are going to the core and the heart of the technology that now we are harnessing all around the globe, particularly AI, of course. And since AI is becoming one of the defining technologies for our generation in the next coming years or decades, it is at least responsible from our end as a society to reflect on what is the effect of this technology. What are the potential effects of developing and utilizing this technology? And the debate, as you all know, has been around for already some years. This debate has brought in the best minds in the world, not only from the, let's say, from the humanistic side, but as well from the technician side, from the politics and so on. Recently, as you know, we have the Commission has proposed a regulation for artificial intelligence that has basically reflected years of reflection that will basically set up the ground for future development, for the future development of this technology. And I cannot be more excited to be in this particular moment in time in working with this fantastic group of persons and also institutions. I cannot think enough what the University of Santiago de Compostela and what CiTIUS are doing in the field of artificial intelligence and also in explainable algorithms. It's fantastic what they are doing, not only, let's say, on the academic side, but as well on the healthcare side. So I'm really encouraged and also excited to participate in this type of events. So without further ado, I will pass it back to you, Senen, and thank you very much again, and enjoy this event.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel, for your really kind words. Thank you very much indeed. So I don't want to say too much, but I think it is important to thank the speakers and moderators in each of the 3 sessions we will have during this week for their kindness and availability. It was not possible for all the speakers to come here, to come to Santiago due to the pandemic, mainly due to the pandemic. And we will have like to have all of them here to show them even more the gratitude we feel for all of them. But this is the new reality, you know, and in this new reality, the physical and the digital will increasingly coexist. Well, I would like to thank the CiTIUS team who have worked every day very hard to make everything ready. Many people have been collaborating for a long time in the organization. It is always even very delicate and to mention some of them, but I need to do that. Particularly, I would like to give my most sincere thanks to Jose Alonso, Alberto Bugarin, and Raluca. But there are many more people anonymously working very hard to organize this event, of course. The moderation of the sessions will go, in fact, far beyond simply guiding the development of the sessions. The work to prepare them has been intense and began time ago. The excellent work done by the ESRs, as you know, the ESRs are the early stage researchers of the ITNs, young people, as Luca and Alejandra, very young, in fact, who are working on their doctoral thesis in the context of these 2 ITNs, Novaes and NL Foroshai. Well, your work has been fundamental, Luca and Alejandra and the rest of the ESRs. In addition, the moderators will have the collaboration of other ESRs who, although they are not part of the panels, will be essential for everything to run smoothly, and also for us to be able to have a summary report of each one of the sessions in the end of this event, and not just a summary, but also to include some conclusions and some suggestions. Why not? I am sure that these documents, in addition to the debate during the sessions themselves, will be very useful for the long process, really long, at least 2 years or more, that will precede the approval of one so important law as the AI Act. In fact, the AI Act will be one of the most important regulatory decisions to be taken in Europe and even in the world in the coming years. Whether or not this process is successful will affect important issues such as the investments in AI, both investments in research and development and in innovation and businesses, intelligent automation, the respect and defense of individual and collective rights, the development of education and healthcare, the creation of a strong and competitive business framework, and so on and so forth. So that is why we must inform ourselves. We have not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to do that. And also have not only the right, but also the responsibility, I insist, to give our opinion. And that is what we are going to do at this event. I hope that the attendees will do the same, all of you, and also take the floor and tell us what you think about these issues. And let's get started. Thank you all again, and go ahead. So we are here with the two moderators, Luca and Alejandra, and the main speaker, Benjamin Müller. He comes from London, and so the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So, as a brief introduction, good afternoon, and again, thank you, all of you, for dedicating your time and taking part at this first day of the European AI Week hosted by CiTIUS at the University of Santiago de Compostela and sponsored by Microsoft.
Apologies, can you speak a little bit closer to the microphone, please?
Can you hear me better? So, just to give you again, like a brief introduction, panel one will be articulated around the European regulatory framework and its capacity to address the specific challenges in order to optimize the potential benefits of AI, particularly for the industrial competitiveness in an international environment, while mitigating the potential negative impact on society. This current panel is now being recorded, and please, for the people connected online, feel free to report your potential questions. My name is Luca Nannini, and I am an ESR belonging to CiTIUS at the University of Santiago de Compostela, while conducting my PhD research at MinSight by Indra in Madrid. I am part of the analyse AI network, Horizon 2020 ITN, that aims to bring explainable AI solutions through natural language techniques. My background is in linguistics and cognitive science, while having a keen interest in AI trustworthiness issues for industrial and societal applications. I will moderate this panel along with Ms. Alejandra Bringues, who has a background in law and international relations. Her research is narrowed to the rights to information and explanation and the best business practice to comply with the European legal framework. She's a PhD student as well at the University of Southampton and a ESR of the No Bias ITM project. The proposed focus of this panel will depart from Dr. Benjamin Müller report released within the Center for Data Innovation in July of this year. Presenting key insights on the potential HACS costs, debates will be prompt to reflect about the scope of socio-economic implications. An actual debate is ongoing, trying to redefine the HACS key concepts, such, for example, high-risk systems, quality management systems, liabilities, and compliances. Objective today is to shed light on how such definitions might influence costs for providers and regulators of AI systems in the European Union. We aim to debate on concerns and recommendations provided by tech industry advisors, as well as the ones from academia. After Müller's presentation, individual questions will be addressed to each of the panelists. This will allow to establish heterogeneous perspectives to further elaborate presentation stakes. After, audience will be invited to interact with us with follow-up questions for engaging in a moment of open discussion. Moderators will be led for further potential general questions. By the end of the panel, moderators will ask panelists to express a final personal statement. I now proceed to briefly introduce, through my colleague Alejandra, to each of the panelists, departing from our main speaker, Dr. Benjamin Müller. Alejandra.
So good afternoon, everyone. Our main speaker, Dr. Muller, holds a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he is currently a senior analyst on AI policy at Brussels office of the Center for Data Innovation. He will today expose his report, namely How Much Will the AI Cost Europe, released last July. Dr. Ulises Cortés is the scientific coordinator for high-performance artificial intelligence at Barcelona Supercomputer Center. He might be considered one of the pioneers for AI in Spain, having achieved a PhD in this domain from the Catalunya Polytechnic University. There, he is a full professor in computer science, computer systems, with research areas spanning from knowledge acquisition and concept formation in knowledge-based systems, as well as machine learning and autonomous intelligent agents. Mr. Haas is a professor of machine learning at Leiden University Institute of Advanced Computer Science, which research interests spans from artificial intelligence, empirical algorithm, bioinformatics to computer music. In particular, he works on automated algorithms designed on stochastic local search algorithms, being among the originator of the concept of AutoML. Since 2015, he is a fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, and since 2020, a fellow of the European Association for Artificial Intelligence, as well as a fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery. Foremost, he is the founder and chairman of the board of the Confederation of Laboratories for AI Research in Europe, namely CLAIRE, striving to AI excellence for Europe with a human-centered focus. Dr. Kuterer is a senior director at Microsoft for Rule of Law Responsible Tech and European Government Affairs. Her professional area spans from public policy and government affairs, especially for the European Union, with a focus on developing strategies and campaign aligning business goals and regulatory challenges. Dr. Kruger is responsible for AI, privacy, and regulatory policies in the European Union with a focus on digital transformation and ethical implications. She leads a team working on corporate and regulatory affairs, including competition, telecom, and content policies. She has long-standing experience in information society, internet policies at European level, and speaks regularly at regional and international conferences. And our last speaker that we hope can join us soon is Dr. Oliver, who holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in computer science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. She's achieved an impressive contribution to several computer science communities. She's also achieved data science of the NGO DataPop Alliance, which is focused on the use of data and artificial intelligence for social well-being, as well as has been quite involved in the analysis of the impact of pandemic control measures. He is currently developing a framework called FATED. Interestingly, both projects, Claire and Alice, has recently been jointly awarded with the German AI Award due to their respective impact on strengthening European position in the global competition, currently dominated by USA and China. So now that we have presented all our speakers, we will let the panel to our main speaker, Benjamin Muller, who will present his report.
Let me just get my screen sharing up. Needless to say, it's acting up. But we'll get there. There we go. No, sorry, I just have to restart Zoom. Yeah. Well, this is a security matter, so I appreciate Zoom looking into that for me. I'm afraid you're going to have to make me a panelist again on the Zoom. Perfect. Here we go. Lovely. Well, very fitting, I find. Okay, so apologies for the technical mishap, but we're all there now. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I can't stress enough how wonderful it is to be in as beautiful a city as Santiago de Compostela, but also to be in the presence of such a distinguished panel and in the presence of such brilliant minds, old and young. As Senen already alluded to, what we are doing here actually forms a really critical part of the process of creating the EU's AI law, which is the public deliberation. It's a core function of the democratic process that we all engage with the substance of the laws that our legislators want to pass. And as such, I think the debates that we are going to have today and this week are really indispensable. And I've sort of begun to contribute a bit this summer, as was already alluded to, with a report on the potential costs of the EU's draft AI law. And that has in and of itself already kicked off a very healthy process around people trying to sort of gauge assumptions and estimate impacts of various legislative options that are available to us. And I think it's very important from the outset to stress that I'm by no means anti-regulation. I think that one of the areas of agreement that is sort of widely shared is that we are at a point now after a pretty rapid and fast-moving few decades of technological progress where we're entering a new phase of regulatory frameworks around how these technologies, in particular AI, are supposed to be designed and deployed. And I think that the important thing to do really is to try and break down, and this is what I'm going to attempt today, some of the thinking behind what are the actual goals of what we're trying to achieve with regulation, what types of regulation, what forms, what legislative choices are going to help us achieve those goals, and what are suboptimal outcomes that we'd like to avoid, both from AI, ways of using AI that are not socially or economically desirable, but also avoidable or bad outcomes that could come from poorly designed regulation. And I think this is a conversation that's worth having. And so I think it's important to preamble any discussion with AI, and that sort of immediately opens up the can of worms that we're all dealing with. AI is an umbrella term, as computer scientists among you will know. It's not a clearly defined concept. And that's not very helpful when it comes to trying to craft a piece of technical legislation, because more often than not, people sort of read into AI whatever they want and project their own assumptions and views into it, because it's not a clearly demarcated technical area. And the British tech commentator and investor Benedict Evans has written this passage here, and he references Stanley Kubrick's classic 2001: A Space Odyssey, which, if you haven't seen it yet, I think is a very worthwhile investigation of some of the more complex philosophical questions around the far out future of AI. There's a scene there where we go back to the sort of primal beginnings of man, and this black monolith appears out of nowhere, and the apes do not understand it. and they sort of get curious, come close to it, and in the end they get very angry with it. I think that's sort of emblematic of some of the tendencies of what we're seeing. People can get very heated, can get very passionate, and I think that's partly driven by the fact that certainly from a legislative perspective, defining artificial intelligence is very difficult. And that's already our first point in terms of a cost estimate that we'll get into later, the definition of AI. Having said all that, I think it's really important to bear in mind when we talk about this AI-enabled future, that we sort of contrast both the really desirable, positive, socially beneficial outcomes we want to see. Here's an example of a pharmaceutical discovery company in the UK that uses AI to speed up drug discovery, also in integrating genetic science and molecular science. And I think that's a really nice example of how AI can be used to push the frontiers of science and knowledge and take us, humanity, into directions that have so far been closed off because we sort of reached the limits of our scientific understanding. And AI really is a tool that can, in the case of pharmaceuticals, speed up the cycle of drug development and also lower the cost. Now, that's precisely the kind of outcome that we ought to promote. And it's really important to bear in mind that there are some extremely powerful potentials that AI can engender, and we shouldn't shut down the possibility of having those developed in Europe. Equally, it's very important to stress that there are also examples of AI-driven outcomes that we might not want to see. This headline is a bit sensationalist and a bit clickbaity, and I haven't looked into the specifics of it, but obviously the notion that we are judged by algorithms that we don't understand, and that their judgments and decisions have impacts on our income is something that we would be concerned about. And as such, it's completely understandable that people want to avoid a future whereby we sort of gradually hand over more and more power to sort of technically obtuse tools that have a greater and greater influence over our lives. Having said that, I do think that one of the potent driving forces of the debate today is a fear of automation that, once again, is very understandable, but I think is a byproduct of any period of fast technological progress. If we look back to the Industrial Revolution, when we first had cotton mills replacing hand weavers, or when we had the internal combustion engine replacing horses, there are always concerns at the outset of these technological paradigm shifts of people saying, what will this new automated form of doing something we've done different in the past mean for our society? What are the potential harms that come of it? And looking back, of course, we can also say that history illustrates that automation is not inherently bad. In fact, in many cases, it has really added to quality of life. I don't think anyone in here would want to see a return to an age where we do our laundry by hand. Washing machine is an example of automation that is really welcome. There are also much more sort of basic forms of automation of the kind that we see all the time. We use Microsoft Excel, automating forms of accounting that have, made it much easier for people to run their own businesses, where in the past they would have had to do everything by hand with a calculator and on paper. So the general direction of travel as a society, that we're able to uncover new tools to automate more tasks that are otherwise menial and dull for humans, is not one that I think we should be afraid of. And another point I want to raise is that a large bucket of AI tools should be labeled sort of mundanely useful rather than world-changing. I used to work in a financial technology company, and we were able to deploy some really nifty AI tools to screen customer calls and find out which customers were having a bad time and escalate those, and equally to abide by our anti-money laundering rules using AI systems to flag suspicious transactions. These are both processes that in the past would have had to have been done by hand, someone listening to hours of phone calls or someone going through transactions line by line. And clearly, if AI offers means of automating this kind of office work, that's something to be welcomed. However, one area of controversy around the planned AI Act that I alluded to before is the complexity of defining AI. And I think we should be very forthright about the fact that the definition has important consequences. The definition that the EU is currently going for is very wide. I think that most computer scientists or people working in AI looking at the definition on screen would agree that clause A encompasses modern artificial intelligence. This is sort of deep learning, neural networks, and machine learning using unsupervised and reinforcement learning. However, once we get to clause B and C, things certainly get a bit more widespread, because not only could you argue that most, if not all, algorithms are logic and knowledge-based approaches, it's also the case that even if you read this definition favorably and say they're talking about expert systems, which is an alternative approach to AI, that technically works very differently from machine learning, which again is shown on screen. Machine learning sort of takes data and ingests results from the data to generate patterns that it infers from the data, which is completely different from an expert systems approach where you feed data and rules into the system and let it generate the results. So I think that one of the reasons why my cost estimations take a rather wide view is because I think you can build the case that this AI law will actually end up regulating a large chunk of modern day software engineering in a way that isn't often enough discussed. And that's one of the debates to be had. You know, are we focusing on certain forms of AI like deep learning where there are there's a degree of opacity and also sort of lack of control over the output that the system will generate? Or are we actually trying to do something much bigger here, which is sort of set rigorous binding standards for a whole range of software approaches? And my view is that the fact that the definition currently is so wide means we should set the sort of baseline assumption of how much of the economy will actually be affected much wider. Another driving force for the AI law appears to be a sense of techno pessimism, if you want to call it that. I was listening to an event recently featuring a cabinet member of Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager, where he sort of spelled that out. You know, he concludes by saying, how can we best protect consumers? But he precedes it with the rather illuminating comment, the power is no longer in the hands of government to decide what kind of internet we want. And I think, again, there is a sort of legislative assumption in there that the power to set the rules rightly belongs to government, and it's up for governments to decide how we as consumers ought to be protected. This is not to say that's either right or wrong, but it's something to be aware of. There is an underlying assumption of paternalistic legislation, and I think that's reflected in the actual draft of the law. And that stands in stark contrast to some other approaches to innovation that we've seen in the past. Permissionless innovation being a well-known one, where you sort of let the market operate and you let consumers decide, and you don't try and sort of exert a guiding hand from above. I think the rationale that is provided by defenders of the regulation makes sense, that some clarity around what's expected of companies and developers lowers the cost of doing business, because it's unlikely that the regulatory environment will change anytime soon. And that is undoubtedly something to be said in favor of a Europe-wide regulatory framework. I just think that we also ought to, on the other side of the equation, accept the fact that the way in which rules are formulated can have substantial impacts on the adoption of the technology, the amount of investment that flows into it from private sources, and the amount of growth that we can expect the technology to generate. And a reason why cost assessments are inherently controversial and why mine has sparked debate is because I tried very hard to focus on the dog that didn't bark, the opportunity costs, the things that will not be happening as a result of restrictions, and that's very hard to measure. The more horizontal a regulation is, the more of a brute force instrument it is. It means that if you're not going for a sectoral approach, if you say, here is the technology, how we define it, AI, and here is a law that touches anyone using the technology defined in the law, then that is by definition the most horizontal approach you can take. It gets a bit more granular because you then take a risk-based approach and you say, here are various use cases of AI, but nonetheless, the fact remains that this law will apply to anyone whose product contains software that meets the definition that we looked at earlier. And it should also be noted that the risk categories can change. So even if what you currently do is in the low risk category, in future you might be elevated to high risk. Another reason why companies and organizations will have to take this law very seriously, even if they are not initially in the high risk category. And I think that a sort of broad brush horizontal approach doesn't inherently mean that we are also getting incentives to develop good and human compatible AI. It might lead to that as a consequence, but I don't think that such a law can by design foster the right kinds of incentives for companies to proactively, positively get into AI development, and I will get into the reasons for that a little later. Another thing that informs my analysis and has implications for the question of opportunity costs and investments not taken is that I think we shouldn't mince words when we say that Europe's performance in the last 20 years of digital economic development has been subpar, to say the least. This is one of the world's most prosperous regions, one of the world's most well-educated regions. And as such, we should expect it to be at the very forefront of the digital revolution. And that's simply not the case, at least not in the area of the creation of new companies, which are developing these technologies and taking on and competing with established industries, which is one of the ways in which societies progress over time. And I think this graph speaks for itself. Europe is simply not where it needs to be when it comes to spurring on young, talented, ambitious individuals to take risks to create new businesses in new technological fields. And this is something that entrepreneurs raise over and over again. We're regulating a lot, but we're not really focusing on some of the barriers to growth that businesses face. For instance, the access to talent, the ability to grow a business and make money, the tax systems around it, and then obviously also the amount of business regulation that is already pretty hefty in Europe for entrepreneurs. So as I mentioned before, quantifying biggest costs of the ones that I'm looking at is very hard, but conceptually speaking, we're talking about investments not taking place, the pace of digitization slowing down in society, and a brain drain of talented people who would rather develop AI products elsewhere in jurisdictions where they're not facing these costs. Now, one interesting approach taken by researchers at Stanford University to try and sort of get more into these types of costs was taken a couple of years ago when a bunch of Stanford economists ran an online survey experiment where they presented business decision makers with different forms of AI regulation. The baseline being, here's how existing laws already apply. This is something we shouldn't forget. A lot of the ostensible aims of the AI Act, such as you should not be discriminated against are already enshrined in law. The argument is simply that AI is intransparent, and as such, we need a new law to enforce rules around fairness. But the baseline is a lot of protections already exist. The second option they offered were sectorally driven AI rules and regulations. So I used to work in the finance sector. We are obviously very heavily regulated in the UK by the Financial Conduct Authority, but the regulation is very much tailored to specific problems and issues faced by businesses and consumers in that sector. And then the third option that was presented to participants in the survey was a cross-cutting, horizontal, all-encompassing, one-size-fits-all AI law of the kind that we're looking at in the EU. And the results are very interesting. First of all, it's hard to predict in advance how sectors will respond. Some sectors, when faced with a horizontal regulatory approach, will drastically reduce their investments into technology. That's most likely something driven by the willingness and ability of decision makers in those sectors to take risk, whether that is driven by financial considerations or legal considerations. Other sectors, in this instance, in more infrastructure types, actually benefit from horizontal AI legislation. But what is clear is that exposure to general AI regulation means that business managers in charge of making investment decisions become more reluctant to do so, if only to initially to understand the law more. But it would simply be naive to pretend like we shouldn't expect some kind of dampening or chilling effect going forward. The details obviously depend on the exact specifics of the law, but as a general argument, I don't think this should be controversial. And I think that the trade-off here between the expansiveness and the latitude of the AI law and the impact it will have on businesses not created, investments not made, that trade-off is the kind of debate that I want to foster. One area where I'm much more confident in my projections is the specific impact on small businesses and new businesses, startups. This particular survey also found precisely that two years ago, that businesses with revenues of 10 million or less are most affected by any such regulation that creates new requirements and burdens for them. And that just makes logical sense. They already have lower budgets to play with, and they will be less in a position to devote the resources to comply with the law. And interestingly, what they also found in the survey is that large companies respond to being reminded of existing legal protections and existing regulatory frameworks, and respond more to those kinds of approaches than to new laws. New laws end up often affecting smaller organizations most. And this is also something that the SME Alliance in the EU has stressed. The kinds of cost assumptions the EU is taking, 7,000 euros to fulfill a conformity assessment for a high-risk product, are just fanciful. It seems completely unrealistic to anyone who's ever been in a position of actually building a business, which I've seen the work that goes into that, and you're concerned with all kinds of things, developing the product, hiring people, competing in the market, and then throwing in a huge 150-page law that requires sort of legal expertise to make sense of, is a significant cost point. And again, it's about opportunity cost, because your software engineers will have to sit down with the product designers, will have to sit down with the compliance people, and make sure that everything is legally sound. And the kinds of figures that the EU is presenting as what SMEs can expect this law to cost them, I think, are far too low. I think another bone of contention is that the counter arguments that get rolled out by the Commission is that, well, you know, the figures you say, 400,000 euros to set up a quality management system, that's only if you don't already have one, and most businesses do have one. Therefore, this business as usual assumption applies. And I would really contest that very strongly, because first of all, if most businesses already have this kind of approach to quality management and product development, then the law seems in some sense redundant. And what I keep stressing is that AI, being a nascent, not a mature technology, we're at the beginning of this sort of period of secular change where the way we do business and the way we do computer science is going to be revolutionized. This is precisely the area when you'd expect a lot of new businesses to come up and come into being. And this is exactly where you want to see Europe's brightest minds ask themselves, how can we use this technology to make a difference in the lives of people and consumers? And how can we participate in the value generation potential that AI offers? And very clearly, it's inarguable that a business that doesn't yet exist and wants to get into a high-risk AI area will need to set up a quality management system. And the costs there, even the EU accepts, are vast. And so the question becomes, have we done enough to account for these costs? I think the EU touches upon this sort of buried in page 150 of the study to support the impact assessment, accepting that SMEs may lack significant funds and may thus choose to stay away from the regulated market. Is that an outcome that we want to see? Or are there things we can do to support new businesses? And also there have already been questions raised in the impact assessment about people refraining from producing any regulated AI system to avoid additional costs. And I think this is a really significant part of the debate. I'm going to start wrapping things up by sort of issuing a word of warning. In the year 2000, European policymakers grandly announced that they want to make the EU the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. But unfortunately, lofty announcements is not the same as good policymaking. And the reality is that in the last 20 years, Europe's performance in this tech growth era has just been steadily diminishing. And I think that's really disappointing because of the fact that Europe as a region has so much potential, and we should be aiming for more. We should set our ambitions higher. Rather than contenting ourselves with sort of playing second or third fiddle, the aim should be for Europe to turn into a technology powerhouse. And I think if we seize the opportunity to craft intelligent and well-designed AI regulations, we can do that. But there is a real risk that too blunt and too wide a law can create further damage. And so what I've tried to raise in the presentation are some of the trade-offs that we have to confront. I accept that sometimes a broad regulatory response is necessary, but there needs to be a compelling rationale for it, such as environmental protection or people's health and safety. We should be aware that in the absence of a compelling rationale, the very complex and sometimes unforeseeable effects and hard to measure unintended costs can cause real damage. And we should also spend a bit of time thinking about how existing laws and existing regulatory approaches already help to achieve some of the aims of the law. And then lastly, I promise I stop here. This is more as something to be discussed if anyone is interested. There are other cost drivers that I haven't gone into in detail here. Some sectors say their regulatory burdens will be duplicated. Healthcare is already very heavily regulated, and there are some who believe that they're going to have to do 2 conformity assessments instead of 1. There's also questions around whether some of the high-risk labeling is realistic enough. Biometric authentication is considered high risk. Maybe we should create a new category for biometric identification, like when you open your phone with your facial recognition. This is something that's widely used for banking apps, for instance. Does it really merit inclusion in the high risk category? And then what I'm not going to get into at all is the thorny legal and philosophical questions around trying to ban subliminal techniques that distort a person's consciousness, because that's worth a presentation in and of itself. The most significant policy change I really want to push for in the debate is we need to do more with the sandboxes. The sandbox provision in the law right now does not go nearly enough. We need to do more to encourage people to participate in the AI revolution and not burden them from the get-go with too many rules that make it too difficult for them to help us build a better future in Europe. And I'll conclude with that, and I look forward to the discussion to follow.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, for your introduction. It's a kind of really like fast personal reflection. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating and interesting. Like this idea that an approach that is considered horizontal to regulation is centralized, is brute force like instrument as you're defining. And let's say now we're going to move to the individual question to each panelist. And we'd like to start with questions addressed to Dr. Nuria Oliver, still concerning this topic, like especially the topic of what is an Highrisk system, how we can define that. And the question for Ms. Oliver is this. We know that with the Valencian community, you have conducted an impressive work at monitoring COVID-19 spread throughout the province. With the aid of a new team of data scientists, you coordinated in building several AI tracking systems. If a strict ban, as the one proposed right now, over Highrisk AI system will come in force in 2 years, how do you think that this kind of research might change for future emergencies, such as a pandemic?
Thank you for the question. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I don't think you have been affected at all, because I don't think it's a high risk application. What we have been doing, we have been working on several areas with the objective of informing the public policy making and the decision making of the president of the Valencian autonomous region in Spain. But there hasn't been a single direct impact on any individual, and there hasn't been any kind of analysis of any individual or personal data. So I don't think that would be impacted by this regulation. Having said this, it is certainly controversial and complicated to determine sort of like exactly what a high risk application is. And as was mentioned before, even the classification of the risk of a certain application could change over time. And whoever is determining such a classification certainly has a lot of power, because the implications of the risk assessment are very different in terms of regulatory requirements. So I think it's as complex and difficult as it is to determine whether something is an AI system or not, because as anyone that has done any software development or understands how software development works today, the systems that we use today are extremely complex, have a lot of modules, and it's not clear what percentage of the system has to have some kind of AI embedded in it to be determined to be an AI system, if it is the entire system or just that particular module. And the same thing happens with the assessment of the risk. It's a complicated matter. However, what I think a large portion of the population and policymakers have realized is that because of the characteristics of AI being software that is easily scalable and deployable, and potentially has the ability to reach and impact the lives of millions and millions of people in a very short amount of time, something needs to be done to minimize the negative impact that such deployments could have if no provision and no assessment and no evaluation has been made of what kind of impact they could have. And I think that is a fact, the fact that not every, evidently not every technology that we develop entails positive impact for society at large. And it is so easy to deploy large-scale systems today and potentially negatively impact the lives of so many people that, you know, something needs to be done before the systems are deployed so quickly. So I think the need is there, and the complexity and the difficulty and the devil is in the detail as to how to implement a framework that would minimize the negative risks and consequences while maximizing the positive impact that technology could have. So we will see how this proposed regulation evolves. I think it's by no means perfect, as it has been presented before and raised by many people, but I think it's a courageous step in the right direction of realizing that something needs to be done. It's not sustainable to continue the way as we are with a completely generally unregulated situation, except for the verticals where there is regulation, like healthcare or finance, where there is already a lot of regulation in place. But for consumer general sort of like social digital services that consumers use on their phones, for example, there isn't really any kind of regulation, irrespective of the negative impact that they could have on their health.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. And following the idea that you have already presented about developing a framework, we would like to ask you that you are developing, or you have already developed, a framework called Phaeton for AI recommendations for social good. So you have also published with the Data Alliance a research paper about the key requirements for sustainable private data sharing and use for public goods, where you present also the open algorithms. So do you find any specific commonalities and discrepancies between the AI Act and those frameworks that you have already presented?
Yeah, well, I see that you have read a lot of our work, so thank you for doing that. Yes, I mean, obviously, the regulation talks about a lot of the main concepts that are proposed in most of the sort of like ethical frameworks that have been presented regarding AI, in terms of fairness, you know, or guarantees of non-discrimination, in terms of transparency, you know, explainability, interpretability, in terms of guarantees of non-manipulation of human behavior, in terms of veracity. So I think there are a lot of terms that are, you know, almost ubiquitous on any document that talks about, you know, ethical implications of AI, you know, accountability and so forth. So I do think, again, that the challenge is how to translate those concepts into actions and into a framework that provides the guarantees that we need for minimizing the negative impact, while at the same time encouraging and enabling you know, new ideas to be tested and to appear and to flourish. There is another element that we discuss in one of those papers, which is the political element. So I think a lot of these issues are technical challenges. You know, we need to have algorithms that are able to determine, you know, the level of discrimination or not. You know, we need to have algorithms or systems that are explainable, you know, that a non-expert could understand them, you know, and so forth. But there is also a very important political and human element to it, which is we do have, you know, we do have a well-established system of power that where, you know, the people that hold the power don't have a lot of incentives to not have the power anymore. And unfortunately, in the 21st century, we're actually witnessing a polarization in the accumulation of power, and a lot of this power is right now in a handful of technology companies. So I think the European regulation is also trying to provide a framework that would act as an equalizer of such power, understanding also that a lot of those companies are non-European companies, and we do face the big challenge in Europe of lagging behind North America and China in research, in innovation, and in the deployment and use of AI. And having enabling regulatory framework, as it was mentioned previously, is positive from the perspective that everyone knows the rules of the game, and it offers more certainty than not having something like that. But again, the difficult issue here is what would be such an enabling regulatory framework, and I think it's a very difficult task, and there isn't a single unique answer to it. Yeah, so I think we have to continue providing feedback to the proposed framework and see how it evolves. But in general terms, as I said originally, I think is a positive move, the fact that Europe has realized that there has to be some kind of regulation.
Well, thank you very much for your opinion. In this case, we want to ask Mr. Hosch a question, because we are aware that we are trying to develop a more sustainable, accountable, trustworthy AutoML. So we would like you to ask you two questions. The first one is, do you think that the Artificial Intelligence Act will far sort cataloging the AutoML applications as prohibited or high risk? And the second will be that do you envision any specific strategy and recommendation to overcome the ambiguities of such definitions for your research?
Well, thank you very much. As Nuria has already said, you've done quite a bit of homework. And in my case, you've gone even further in that, you've dug up things that I haven't even said or written yet. But you did that well because, it is a legitimate question. And speaking about AutoML, of course, the first thing we have to realize is that AutoML is the bleeding edge of ML, and ML in many ways is at the bleeding edge of AI, right? There are other things too that form the bleeding edge, both in terms of ML research, of course, as well as in terms of AI research. But AutoML is a thing that can be very consequential because it lowers the barrier of entry to building and deploying and maintaining ML systems. It makes it easier for people that don't have a PhD, to say it sort of very simplistically, to get good results with an ML system. And so it's very natural to ask, doesn't this make it even more likely that irresponsible things are being done? And maybe if the act comes into effect, illegal things will be done, right? And so here I would say any consideration that applies to machine learning would also apply to automated machine learning, right? So in terms of high-risk applications of machine learning and other AI technologies that the act would prohibit or at the very least heavily regulate, put under costly scrutiny, as Ben has said, the same would hold for AutoML methods. With the AutoML methods, it's even easier to sort of reach a really broad audience. It's even easier to bootstrap into having the kind of performance that could allow people to create, for instance, a company, a good business model with less technical expertise. So the risk that we're stifling innovation even more by applying the overly broad act to AutoML is even larger. So in Ben's words, perhaps if I can guess how he would see this, is the opportunity cost if you start to cut into AutoML and its applications would be even higher. And that is a concern, to be honest. But to be also honest with you, I don't think this is the overriding concern. The overriding concern is very much what Ben has been discussing in his presentation. While I very much, like Nuria said, also appreciate the fact that in Europe action is being taken to use AI responsibly. I think this is very important. I'm completely against sort of a laissez-faire approach where we say, well, you know, whatever brings value in terms of business opportunities, we should allow to have done. I think that's very dangerous. And we can go further into detail as to why that is more dangerous for AI than for other technologies. But I really think it is, partly because things happen on a much faster scale. Right, and this includes the accumulation of power as a result of you know, successfully deploying AI techniques that then basically sort of supercharge a business model to the point where it can rapidly generate vast amounts of income. Right, so I do think the Act is well motivated, just as Europe is doing well in setting a level of ambition, saying we want to be a powerhouse in AI. Right. Sure, but that's relatively easy to say, still good and important to say. And now the question is, how do we follow through? And here, I think not only is the Act, you know, completely unaware of AutoML, which perhaps is forgivable because that's sort of a relatively new and still niche thing. It also seems to be sort of hopefully unaware of how certain you know, fundamental truths in AI and specifically ML are. You know, if you look at how the Act talks about, for instance, the need for accurate training data and things like this, it becomes very clear that from a technological point of view, the people who've written that appear to be completely unaware of the difficulty of even defining what a truly unbiased training set is, what a truly fully correct set of training data would look like, all the technical difficulties of measuring and ascertaining such a thing are completely glossed over. And then, of course, it's not just about ML, but as Ben said correctly, if we look at how AI is defined for the purposes of the Act, pretty much anything falls under it, right? And even if we don't go into anything that uses any computer program uses logic and therefore falls under the Act, which, you know, I'm not sure that a lawyer would push it quite as far, but that would be disturbing. You know, the third element of the definition talks about statistical techniques and optimization. So now anything that uses statistical techniques and optimization falls under the Act. Wow, you know, that's a lot of legacy systems that all of a sudden become problematic in the high-risk areas. And of course, you know, information technology, optimization, statistical methods are being used in high-risk areas, right? So this, I think, is a real problem. And I don't even want to start thinking about the cost, although listening to Ben, who has thought about it, I'm a little terrified there. Personally and also professionally, I mean, as many of you might know, the CLARE organization that you mentioned kindly before has provided very substantial input to the Commission as a response to the Act. For those of you who haven't seen this, I'm going to put the link into the chat. This is very concrete. It has 12 concerns and 14 recommendations to actually address the concerns. So in reality, you know, I would say there is much to be criticized about the Act, but it's very important that we're now in a position to have these kind of conversations. What matters most to me, to wrap this up, is actually not that we sort of refrain from trying to regulate. I think it's good that we're trying to regulate something. What terrifies me is that the regulation, which is supposed to be one element of Europe's AI strategy, for quite a while now has been left, right, and center of the discussion. And I agree that it needs to be discussed, but if all we do here in Europe is discuss legislation and in the end maybe come up with good law, and our capabilities vis-a-vis the other players, such as, you know, not just the United States and China, but also smaller players like Canada, for example, our abilities erode further. What will happen is that we might be able to protect ourselves through regulation, but all the value creation will happen elsewhere. And we will become technologically quite dependent on other players. We might protect ourselves from what's being used here, right? At the same time as sort of building a walled garden, where inside the wall, the garden, you can't do certain things, right? You can't develop and market certain things. But certainly, you know, the big bucks will be made elsewhere. And also maybe the big benefit to humanity will be centered increasingly elsewhere. And that would be a shame. It would be a shame considering the history of AI in Europe, also the capabilities that are still very much here And most importantly, it would be a shame considering the potential that we have. And here I just want to say one last thing, and that is what makes Europe different in the way we look at many things, including information technology and specifically AI, is this diversity of perspective, right? You have this almost nowhere in the world where people with very different cultural background and with different but related values look at the same thing from very different angles and start sort of taking it apart, start working on it, start shaping it. I really strongly believe if we do something in Europe, be it regulation, be it actually value creation in terms of building AI systems, developing AutoML methods, lowering the barrier to entry for ordinary people, or at least people with low degrees of technical expertise to responsibly use AI system, not on their smartphone, but in their smartphones, but in their job, right? If we do that in Europe, right, driven by these multiple perspectives, we probably will do it in a much more robust way, in a way that is not only beneficial for Europeans, because it makes sure that the thing that works in Denmark and is good for the Danish population also works in Southern Italy and is good for the Southern Italian population, but it will also work beyond, right? It will work in Australia, it will work in Canada, it will work in China and the US. And I think that's the path to success here. But we can't afford to, not have our eyes on the ball. And the ball is, where is AI research going, right? How can we actually prevent from being second class in the world, or maybe third class in the world when it comes to this? And once we miss the bus on AI research, our ability to do impactful AI innovation is severely compromised. And once this is the case, well, then regulation becomes sort of a stopgap measure where all we do is we protect ourselves from bad things made elsewhere. And that would be a shame. This would be as bad as losing, for instance, the automotive industry and saying, sure, we have the best automotive regulation in the world, but we can build the cars in the US or China. That's it from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ross. And if I can leave like what you were saying, like somehow reminding me of a kind of concept that has been developed recently, and is called like accelerating change, that technological improvements not always correspond to social fairness and social improvement. And we have seen already in the chat a few questions triggered by Professor Cortes here, and also with an answer from Ms. Oliver. But I would like now to give the floor indeed to Professor Cortes, addressing a question to him still regarding high-risk AI system. So in particular, let's say that the Barcelona supercomputing center under your supervision is now showing a market interest for trustworthy AI application deployed for the social good. I remember a paper released in 2019 about fairness and another framework for having a kind of ethical approach to the COVID-19 prevention. What we would like to ask you is to which extent do you consider that an ethical approach towards high-risk AI system will be needed, beneficial, or it might be simple, unfeasible? And if you can give an example referring to the high-risk technologies, or maybe other examples of ethical approaches to high-risk system, even outside Europe.
Well, thank you for the question. You did a lot of work, so really you read a lot. That's good. Well, first of all, I don't believe that an ethical approach is only needed for AI. And I believe that we are putting the focus too much in AI. So ethics is needed for all disciplines, either scientific or technological or even humanistic ones. So we have this history about ethics and AI. It's only 4 years, and maybe I repeated myself, but in the last 4 years, we had more literature about ethics than the previous 25 centuries, since Ethica Nicomacheia until 2017, Asilomar principles. That's a bit, less than a half, and then more than a half starts there. And we have a lot of information, a lot of discussion about that. But what it's clear is that we are discussing about ethics because no one puts the focus in the ethical development, innovation, and many other things. So the problem is that we have to educate first individuals to regulate well. So Kant, at the end of the 18th century start with this idea that you first get your principles because you're autonomous, your ethical principles. And then if you want to have regulation, you get into a consensus with the others through legislation. What happened is that there is not anymore this politics where all individuals have their own principles, bring it to the forum, and they start discussion about how they feel about the innovations. We've been facing exponential growth, and this exponential growth of technology at the hand of anyone make us monsters. And one of the main things, for example, regarding unbiased databases is that most of the programs that people use, you can download it from libraries, but the users do not understand the algorithm. They are only users, and they don't have any knowledge about statistics, so they cannot make any test of the distribution of the data. With that in hand, and the need of the big companies just to put the first the product in the market, there is no test, so we need sandboxes. But also, even in highly regulated frames like the fintech, we know that it's not enough. So we just saw in the last days with an shaming position that even the most renowned leaders in the world, they use fintech to take the money out of the taxation system. So why we want to put the eye on single people and the controllers are not controlled anymore? So it is because we suffer a lack of ethics, and we are putting too much the focus on AI. I believe that every technology should be passed through a technology system and a technology legislation. There are risky systems, of course. All these related with COVID. With COVID has been a large experiment to see which are the limits in population, to see how much information you can give, even the radar COVID and any other, these new passports to get into the discourse will be using private information. And it's not well regulated. The technology is not very complicated because it's just a passport. But we don't know which are the algorithms, who is the owner of the data, how long the data will be conserved, to whom we have to call if there is any problem. And for one side, there is a push of the market to open and have all this mobility again. And on the other side, no one is telling you which is the use of the data. And as you said, there is a lot of legislation. We have a lot of legislation about personal data, but no one uses it because no one read it before. And the problem is that we have a population that is not interested in the legislation. They are not interested in the use of the data, but they are really interested in that there is satisfaction, immediate satisfaction. Amazon Prime culture is what we have now. It happened with the vaccines. Everybody wanted to have a vaccine by tomorrow. And for the first time in many years, science became to be a discussion in TV because everybody needed the vaccination. And now we have an ethical issue regarding if there is this vaccine should be obligatory or not, compulsory or not. But that's the same kind of things that will happen with AI systems. So I don't believe that it's a very good idea to have facial recognition. And I have one like yours, and I don't use the facial recognition on this because I don't believe that this very cheap technology, you can use it, but it's not a very good idea. It's cheap, it's fast, you can be comfortable with that, but it's not a very good idea because you don't know what the data is. You don't know which is the algorithm, and you don't know who is using it. So you have the mobile that is very interesting, but you cannot use the facial. And I believe that the banking systems doing that, they are just breaking in the personal data, and you cannot use it. And there is places where to vulnerable people that they are unable to do digital tools, you want to use facial recognition to get into the services. That's very strange. And you don't know that there is no real regulation about that. But there are city halls that are doing that. So again, first educate the people and then use. And I don't believe that we have to grow at any place, at any pace and at any price. And if we are the second, but we are happy with our growth and the kind of economy that we can create with ethical values, that's better than be the first and not being in a comfortable and ethical place.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to conclude with this first session of questions, we want to address Meet Couturer and ask her what kind of disadvantages will large companies on one hand and small and medium-sized companies on the other have from the implementation of the AI Act in the way it has been proposed, and so the classification of high-risk system and its possible ban. We will also ask you how you envision firms' liability and distribution of obligations across parties based on the AI Act, and how would you frame it in another way if you will do that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me in this great panel. I really appreciate that we have a longer conversation as well, because often we have these 45 minutes discussions and then you can actually not dig into more detail. And I will say that I have agreed with a lot of the points that were already raised in the context of the AI Act. I would not necessarily phrase it, and I would also caution against this big companies versus small and medium-sized enterprise companies. It will a little bit depend what type of company you're talking about and where they are in the value chain of the AI Act. And let me explain this a little bit more in detail. Companies like Microsoft have invested a lot of resources to operationalize responsible AI. So the ethical principles to which we have committed a couple of years ago have been now transposed into standard that our engineering groups have to implement in order to develop and design AI responsibly. And it's based on also these learnings that we provided comments as Holger did to the Commission's consultation. But based on the fact that we have done a lot of the work in terms of an internal compliance process, we are looking at the AI Act really in comparison to what we are already doing and what is changing. We believe that the cost here might not only be for small, medium-sized enterprises that develop and deploy AI. That's certainly a big factor here. But where we see innovation potentially at risk is on the deployment side of AI. The structure of the AI focuses very much on the provider's intended use. And it is well so that we describe in our terms to our customers the intended use and the limitations, and sometimes also the prohibitions where we do not believe that the specific AI system has capabilities in certain areas. But that is from our perspective. That should not guide what is allowed to be done by the user. And I will say that I'd prefer to talk about the deployer and not the user, because in reality also what happens is that our customers, so the users of our AI, are very much defining the defined application. In reality, in particular as general purpose AI services, we often do not have the imagination in how our customers would deploy these AI systems. And it is on the deployment side where a lot of the innovation is taking place. So by the risk allocation as it is put, will put a lot of emphasis of the intended use as described by the provider, and this will limit certainly innovations on the deployment side. Then the second part here, and this goes sort of, I'm mixing this now with the second question, customers combine multiple AI systems or components. So to a certain extent, we feel that we might actually fall outside of the scope of the AI Act because we often provide components of an AI system and not the AI system. And so the responsibilities fall again on the deployer of the AI system or those who assembles the diverse components to produce an AI system. And of course, the users very often customize the AI system with customer data, and so it becomes more dynamic, and the responsibility as described in the AI system might shift to the user by doing so. There's one provision there that specifically alludes to this fact. More generally, AI systems are becoming more general capable, and I think that is something that was also mentioned by Holger in his intervention. So the allocation of obligations has to be rethought, in particular when it comes to the AI systems that are high risk, listed in Annex 3, that are services. And in this context, with everything that I said before, I think the Commission's intentions were to go up the value chain and putting all the allocations here. But the reality is that with AI systems in place, you have certain control areas in the design and the development of an AI system, but the controllability over the AI system when it is deployed lies with the user/deployer. And so here there is an interesting mix between what is regulated for product safety and what is regulated for these high risks that relate more to fundamental rights. We mentioned before non-discrimination, fairness, and these kind of more personal rights. There is, I think those services cannot be regulated as products, and the grounding of the AI Act in the new legislative framework as it was built for product safety do not really fit in the context of Annex 3 for the services. So there needs to be a more nuanced approach in how you reallocate those responsibilities. And this doesn't mean that it's only on one or the other. We just need to think this a little bit more through. And by doing so, we can think about other analogies, not only the new legislative framework based on product safety legislation, but for example, how was it done in GDPR? You have the controllers and the processors, and here the allocation is really aligned with the controllability of the intent, of the purpose of the use with the controller, the technical side with the processor. Or you can think about tort law to find a better allocation of those risks. So I think there is a lot still that needs to be done in this space to talk through this.
Yeah. Well, you can turn off the microphone. We have this one. Cornelia, our apologies, but we had apparently like a audio system fault, so like we lost a bit of your discourse, and we were hearing you just like from one speaker. But anyway, we will try to catch up like as soon as possible, and okay. We are still trying to figure out.
Now I can see you back. No.
So I also have to connect.
I did hear it fully, so it might be only the room.
Well, it's time for a bottle break.
Un segundo.
This is the promised land.
Looks like only the on-site part has this technical
Yes,
problem.
exactly.
Huh? I think the rest, I'm wondering whether it's very impolite if the rest of us talks a bit while they are sorting out their problem,
I think
rather
we
than
should.
just wait quietly.
We definitely should. I don't know whether did you hear me? You could follow,
Oh, yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at least for me, you were never gone. It was
Okay.
just fine.
Yeah, like with
Same
Gabrielle.
here, Cornelia. And I think since we're being recorded and listened by all the audience, so it makes sense to continue a conversation if you agree.
I mean, Cornelia, I really liked some of the points that you made, right? And one of the thoughts that popped up in my head as you spoke about, some of the difficulties regulating something, that might be built by Microsoft or another company and then deployed and heavily customized, right? Fed with different data, but also reconfigured, and then, still wanting to have the company responsible for it. I think that's exactly one of the differences between AI and much other technology, right? That AI really takes this to a completely different level, this configurability, this adaptability. And I mean, of course, that's part of the power, right? Mm-hmm. But that also is part of the reason why we can't treat it exactly like other technology. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And there is this additional piece that, as we describe this, usually it's sort of the difficult questions in how you actually achieve fairness, accountability, transparency are really socio-technical issues, or how do you reduce, I wouldn't even say how do you have an unbiased result, because I firmly believe there is no such thing as unbiased results ever. But how do you reduce known biases that we socially and societally want to avoid, like gender bias or race bias? And for that, again, we do mitigate this, for example, by integrating specific techniques into the development life cycle of an AI system. So data is already in the training data curated in order to have the same quality of service for different demographic populations. Exactly. But of course, then when you deploy it, you need to continue with this quality management in the deployment to continue with this result, or you might actually need to specifically adapt it. And again, here, at least for Microsoft, we have started to, on top of our own standard and our own practices and tools and transparency notes for customers, we are now also developing tools that are built in the technology to allow our customers to have them being more transparent, to think about fairness in their specific context. And again, here the responsibilities, and this is what we need to still discuss, and I will say we have not really figured out what the better alternative is. But as I mentioned, in GDPR at least, which relates to services, the controller processor distinction at least aligns with the controllability of the area that you're handling the data, or respectively the controller who really makes the decisions for what purposes the data is used in which context. And tort law functions very similarly, where you have this, the areas of responsibility relate to the area of controllability. And that is, I think, what is missing a little bit. There's an interesting other aspect, and that's a little bit far off to our discussion, but I think through a lot, which is in the context of, in particular, the public sector high-risk uses. The current AI Act, I think, misses two important points, which is, first of all, the transparency towards the citizens that might be impacted. So you have this database on the provider side, but in reality, what you really need is when a school uses AI, the school has an obligation to tell the parents that they're using an AI system, right?
Exactly.
So that is sort of that transparency on the user or deployer side is missing entirely. And at the same time, what we have is a state-governed supervision authority, but with GDPR or with the DPA's data protection authorities are independent. I think the independency has an important role when it comes to fundamental rights and protection of fundamental rights. And in Annex 2, in Annex 3, with the high-risk fundamental rights, which relate to fundamental rights, like discrimination, fairness, etc. I think there's in particular in the areas where we actually talk about high risks in governmental usage. I think there's a bit of an issue here with the control over what the government is doing. In relation to the high risks.
One could say, they wrote some big exceptions for themselves, right? That is also something that from Claire's perspective is a bit problematic. They really seem to be using two different measuring sticks there, wanting everyone to believe, well, if government does it, then you shouldn't be so concerned. And I think that's a bit naive.
Yeah, and it's interesting also. I mean, I think there is two fundamental issues that need to be course corrected. The one I mentioned is the intended use, which really should lie with the deployer. That notwithstanding the fact that providers might want to, limit the use of their own technology according to their own ethical principles, which is different from law. It's sort of their own terms of use. And then the allocation of those risks that interestingly, on the product safety side, they make the switch. They say, well, the manufacturer, so the user who is the manufacturer, will be held responsible for those obligations. So there is a double twist in how it is regulated. And I think that the attempt to regulate AI systems embedded in products the same way as AI systems that are used in services, or that might be the baseline for decision that is made in a service, are two very different things.
Yeah. I mean, one of the difficulties that I personally see here is, you talked about, you spoke of control, and I think that's very important, right? I mean, meaningful human control is actually also one of the high-level expert groups' important goals for trustworthy AI, right? And of course, I think Ben talked a little bit about that. We can twist it whichever way, but using AI is ultimately about diminishing human control, or at least lifting it to a different level, because it's not that we necessarily take humans out of the loop, but we abstract the human control to a different level, where very much like pilots using an autopilot, now it's a much less close connection between the controls that might still be there and the effects, right? And I mean, that's what was interesting about the auto ML question, where it's yet another level of indirection, right? Now imagine Microsoft is selling, or anyone is selling, an auto ML tool, right, to another provider that uses the auto ML tool to make an ML component that then gets built into a system, right? So what do you have now, right? And who can meaningfully actually foresee how changes to the AutoML tool might affect users of the ML system downstream? That's incredibly hard to do, right? And so my feeling is sort of this maybe typical European approach, we have to get this 100% watertight and right, might not be the best one there, right? This is where, having lived for many years in Canada, I always feel maybe the case law view on things has an advantage, right? Where you go, obviously we want to protect people from doing stupid things, right? We don't want anybody to do things that we already know are irresponsible and lead to damage, right? But maybe we can't foresee all the stupid and irresponsible things. And maybe what we really have to do is create the mechanisms that recognizes stupid and dangerous behavior, and then, you know, makes it, first of all, easy to detect, and secondly, it then creates an incentive and a burden to fix it, rather than to prevent it from occurring in the first place, which I think in the case of AI is incredibly hard, actually.
Yeah, and I will read, there is a comment from someone who is still in the audience, which is great. So my question, is it necessary to achieve a better understanding of the attitudes towards artificial intelligence and the forms of interaction with it, especially because of the hour of objectivity and fallibility that today's culture imports to AI? Accordingly, we must ask, to what extent can European law develop to address these complex dilemmas? How can the European Union approach all these developments, especially with increasing ambiguity, when in the future of the problem of artificial intelligence, effective computing bias overlap with the problem of the biotechnical revolution? That's a harder question. I will say one, and this is a little bit from the Microsoft experience in developing our AI, responsible AI governance model, which is complex, and it has the development of the standard, but it is really the overall responsible AI is really set at the highest level of Microsoft. The leadership has the buy-in, and what it entails is that we are all we have, for example, a 101 responsible AI training that each Microsoft employee has to take. Why I'm saying this is because it's not only about a compliance mechanism of tick boxes. You need the people buy-in, and that goes to all the people that work with the AI system. They are an important part of the equation. So there needs to be a culture shift. People need to understand this sort of is a big yes to your first question. The people is an important aspect so that it is deployed. And it goes really to the point where I personally can become very philosophical, is sort of this AI is data correlation, and we need to understand when an AI system makes a decision, or when an AI system augments the people that are using the AI system. And there are many occasions, in particular those in the Annex 3, I think these are all areas where I would say the AI systems are there to augment the capabilities of people who make ultimately the decisions, and not the AI system itself. And this goes and then at the same time, I will say, if you don't have the culture shift, oh, you're all back?
Yes, we are.
Sorry, yes, we figured how to plug in. It was like, again, our apologies. It was a connection problem. We are now calling back the audience into the meeting room. So we will like shortly be able to restart, let's say in maximum 1 minute.
Well, actually, you might be interested to know, we had like 20 attendees here the entire time, which is why we basically continued, Cornelia and I, right? So
yeah, I think we saw you, like you were holding still the floor. You had like the conversation going, so like that was a good cue.
And also very interesting. So if I may, in this case, just finish this one sentence, which is,
sorry,
yeah, the human oversight. You also need to. So who controls the human? The humans need to be also able to do this functional role. So you have the human computing interaction in itself is a huge research area. that is developing. So this in itself raises tons of questions.
Can I just say one thing about this, because I think it's really fascinating, Cornelia, what you were saying, and I mean this is the question of Salam al-Ramadi, right? That has been addressed here. I mean, I really think this, you know, the starting point of his question, this aura of objectivity and infallibility that today's culture imparts on AI. I think this is one of the biggest problems, right? I think as soon as you have people that go like, it's an AI system, surely it must know what it's doing, surely it can do things better than me, right, as an employee. That leads to the kind of things that in other sectors, for instance, the aviation industry has caused a huge loss of property and life, right? When people stop questioning common sense or their own experience and expertise. And I think, you know, there we can not only through regulation, although that probably plays a role, but also just in the way we build AI systems. And Cornelia, you actually alluded to this, right? Because this is ultimately an HCI and also psychology question. We can and should build AI systems that invite that invite people to question them rather than making it hard to question them, right? And that is exactly one of the parts where I think in Europe we can maybe have a bit of innovative thinking and have a global influence as well, right? This, you know, I work sometimes on something that you might call self-monitoring AI, which is essentially AI systems that are not only aware, but also communicate very openly about their own limitations. For example, a machine learning system that says, look, the data that I'm operating on now is so different from the training data I've seen, you know, you better stop trusting me, or perhaps, you know, I just won't do this job any longer because I'm out of my depth, right? I think we train human experts to do precisely this, right? We train human pilots, human doctors to say in certain situations, I don't want to handle that, so I will not be in the situation unless they're forced to, right? I think we should do the same with AI systems, actually. And that is something where technologically, maybe encouraged by practices and regulation, we can and should make still huge progress, in my opinion.
But basically, the idea of a real autonomous intelligence system is that he can decide when and whether to work or not, knowing their capabilities. And that's in the basics of the definition by Goulrich and Jennings at the very beginning of the times. And the thing is that if you only focus on machines that learn but do not have, let's say, an ontological reference, or they know exactly their intentions and their capacities are well not defined, it will be very complicated to do that. So the self-assessment that you propose is already there in the autonomous systems from the very beginning, but it has been, let's say, put it out of the focus because now we have an excessive attention over just machine learning and basically deep learning and their derivatives. But we have to think that there is, on the basics of AI, there is a cognitive approach that shouldn't be forgotten. If not, we are doing other things, but not what is the classic definition of AI, that is trying to understand the mechanisms that underlie intelligence, and animal intelligence, not only human intelligence.
Well, thank you very much for keeping the conversation open while we were having some technical problems. We would like to open the debate with our audience that it's here. So if anyone has the question, you can maybe raise your hand. Yeah, please. And if you can speak a little bit louder. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask Mr. Müller a couple of questions. And yes, first of all, thank you very much for this informative presentation.
I'm sorry, we can barely hear. If you can speak closer to the microphone.
Yes, 1 second. We are giving them some microphones.
Yes.
That it works now?
Can you hear me?
No. If not, you can maybe come closer here.
Or you can
well.
Yeah,
repeat the question.
if you please, like, please come at the council. That's talking about digital innovation. We are facing so old-fashioned issues here.
Can I stay here like this?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for the presentation and this different, rather market-oriented or socio-economical perspective. And I would like to ask you the following. I was thinking that the ultimate objective of the AI Act is the protection of fundamental rights while fostering innovation. Thus, innovation, it's important, but rather a secondary objective of the AI Act. And I was wondering whether this fact impacts and how your cost assessment. This is the first question. I could maybe go here.
Yeah, I think that's obviously a very good question, and it sort of goes to the heart of the debate. Certainly, the way that policymakers are framing it, and that's one of the motivations of this law, is that we need our rights to be protected, and there's just nothing that is wrong with that philosophical approach. I would point to a couple of things. Firstly, given that the proposed law will have a significant impact on the sort of political economy of the digital sector in Europe, there needs to be a very strong case that certain rights are at risk. And the law needs to be designed in response to concrete evidence of certain rights that could be violated with AI technology. And I think the trade-off between it's either we protect our rights or we innovate is a false dichotomy that's sometimes presented. There are plenty of interconnections between the protection of our rights and the progress that we experience in terms of quality of life and the technological progress we experience as a society, insofar as the structure of our whole political system is underwritten by the prosperity generated by a well-functioning market economy. And if we take the view that rights are all about risks, and it's all about our rights are constantly being threatened by someone, rather than we also have rights to do things, the right to engage in the market, the right to partake in technological progress, I think that really can affect the debates in a way that anything will be justified, any kind of regulation, because it's all about protecting our rights. And that's also a line of reasoning that you often hear with things like surveillance. It's all about protecting our security. And what I'm trying to do is add a bit of nuance to say that things are not so simple. It's not the case that either we get AI innovation or all our rights will be undermined. And I think the main thrust of my thinking is, one of the panelists raised it before earlier. I took a note. I thought it was an interesting point. It was about the evolution of power in our societies over the last few decades. Who has power? Where has it shifted to? And obviously the framing of the debate is that power has shifted to the owners of capital and the owners of technology. And I think that's a political viewpoint that we absolutely need to pay attention to. But that viewpoint does not have a monopoly on reality. And there are also different equally valid viewpoints around the distribution of power and what this law will do to it. Because what it does is it redistributes power not into the hands of people, but in the hands of regulators and rule makers. And we see that any time that people are given the ability to set up certain legal constraints and binding requirements, that actually the power base mutates towards one that is more grounded in bureaucracy. And what I want to stress is that we have an opportunity with AI, something that Holger made so vivid, that it's actually about shifting power back into the hands of people in terms of users and developers and intelligent students like yourself who come up with ideas and should be able to execute them and take them out into the real world and freely participate. And the framework, the ultimate framework we end up with should strike the right balance between protecting our rights, but also protecting our freedoms to create businesses and our freedoms to act individually, and ultimately our freedom to, I guess, participate in charting our own future. And that is really what AI is about for me as well. We're entering a sort of no-code revolution where the barriers to entry are being lowered. And there is certainly an argument you can make that we're living in a time where power is actually, in some sense, shifting back to users, because we have access to more knowledge and more ability to take part in the world, as it were, than ever before. And that has to be recognized, just as we have to recognize that there are real risks of discrimination and that certain systems could come about that could make things worse with discrimination. And so for me, it's about finding that right balance. I hope that answers that.
Yes, of course. I have a couple of remarks. Yes, thank you. I have a couple of remarks on that. First of all, to put it in other words, would your cost assessment change in the case that the AI Act would aim to protect innovation, like in practical, like from economic perspective, because I'm not familiar with that, or that would be the same?
No, the counterbalance is if we can generate more growth from this law, that balances out the cost of these avenues closed down that I raised in my analysis.
If I can interrupt also, because we are a bit like behind the schedule. I know as Ulysses here want to make a comment, and also Holger, and afterwards I'd like to pose a question like about the economic implication forecasts made by the reports, because like there is an ongoing debate that is now like involving like few other, let's say, people in that are reading the impact assessment. So Ulysses.
Thank you. So there is, I want to raise one warning. Every time we talk about rights, there are an obligation associated with each right. So maybe there is a right to innovate, but there is an obligation to follow the rules, the legislation. And there is only freedom if everybody is able to follow the rules. So the Kantian political thinking is that you are given part of your autonomy to have interactions, social interactions in freedom, and you accept the legislation. But for every right, you have an obligation, and everybody thinks only in rights. That's something that is very strange, and it's very easy to claim for your rights, but you have to be ready to be faithful with your obligations with society and with the environment. The other thing is that human rights change, as every right should change, because societies are evolving. And now we have a new player. So before we have only human to human, maybe state to state interactions. And now we have machines that are interacting and are modifying the way we interact. And the reason, because the power is changing from the state to big companies, is because now you have machines that create interaction is faster, and there is someone that took the holes of regulation to make a profit of that. And we are unable to cut this power of these companies, because even if you create a regulation, we are not putting the fines that are the appropriate ones when you broke the law. And if I believe that the largest fine ever paid by one of these companies in Europe is like a few millions of dollars. Even if it's hundreds of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, it will never damage their capital, so they don't care. And they have tons of lawyers that will make this procedure to long last. So the first that should be aware of their obligations with society are those companies. But if those companies don't have names and you cannot go and put the appropriate restrictions to their power, you have to comply the rules and pay in the appropriate way. If you don't do, then we are not doing anything. They have lawyers and they have the power.
This is a really important point. I take a dynamic view of the economy, and I think sometimes the view that is about, oh, the big companies have too much power and they're abusing our rights and they're not paying their fines, it's a very static view. Because if you think about how can you actually rectify suboptimal social situations, I can't help but think back to the company that I worked at, because it was able to, thanks to the innovation framework in the UK, directly compete with large existing banks. Banks that had dominated the market for many, many decades, had very little incentive to innovate. They had a captive market, and technology made it possible for people to come in and say, we can actually compete with you. We can offer a better product. It's better for consumers. They get a better price. They get a better service. It's good for us. It's good for the people that we can employ, creating jobs in the process, and it widens the marketplace. And I think what's neglected too much of the time is that regulation can actually erect barriers to entry that makes the economy more static and less dynamic. For all the flaws that the United States has, one thing it is very good at is a constant churn of new entrants coming onto the market, offering new services, leveraging new technologies, because they're able to do so at a lower cost than in Europe. And that's something that I think really needs to be discussed. When it comes to AI, it's also a case of, as Cornelia raised, another hidden cost is the adoption of these tools. If businesses fear that they're going to be liable for using it, they're going to not bother, not going to invest in that. And so there's this whole rat tail of consequences that filter down from a law that tries to regulate everything in one go. And that's why I personally favor a sectoral approach that tries to take into account the nuance of the different marketplaces and industries that we do.
Sorry to interrupt again, and because there is Mr. Haas has been raising his hand like since 5 minutes.
Oh, no, it wasn't that long, but I'd like to say something here indeed. So I mean, Ben, I very much agree with you, but I think the last argument is a little dangerous, right? So first of all, you know, if you look at market power that is almost monopolistic, that exists in the area that is now powered by AI. I mean, I'm not sure how you look at Facebook, for instance, or at Google, right? So I think, you know, lawmakers in the US are getting quite concerned about this, right? And I think you can say the same thing for other players. And, you know, as somebody who comes from the technology side, I would really warn against thinking that this is, just another kind of technology. And of course, you know, it's easy for people to catch up. No. This is the kind of technology where if you're a little ahead today, chances are you will be much further ahead tomorrow, and you will basically have an advantage that will be almost impossible to bridge 5-10 years down the road. And I would say this with confidence, having seen how ML research shifts to auto ML research at the cost of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times the computation, right? We're now talking about computational resources that very few companies on the planet muster, right? And that therefore will not be readily accessible to new entrants in the market. Now, of course, there is a balance, as you say, to be struck, right? But to be very honest, I think it's deeply problematic to say that, you know, AI is the kind of technology where it's easy to catch up with the leaders once you've fallen really behind it. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I think it really gets increasingly hard because it becomes a talent and a resource game. And the better you are at the talent and the resources, the more attractive you become to talent and the more resources you can create. And that is a dynamic that I think is actually quite deeply disturbing. The second point I want to make very briefly is this. I do agree with all the arguments that the act is overreaching, right? And I said earlier to Cornelia, when I think we only had part of the audience here, you know, having lived in Canada for 20 years, I've developed a good appreciation for the difference between, you know, case law and what might be old-fashioned called, in an old-fashioned way called Napoleonic code, right? The one is more prescriptive, the other is a little bit more reactive. right? And I think AI is one of these cases where whoever is trying to be overly prescriptive is actually doomed to failure, because computer systems already fail us in ways that for experts, for the best experts, are incredibly hard to predict and sometimes very hard to rectify as well. And with AI systems, which is the cutting, bleeding edge of computation, right, it's even more so. So we need to absolutely be prepared to see kinds of failures, kind of situations that we did not anticipate. And I think what the act should really try to do is it should prevent us from doing things that we already know are poor practice and lead to avoidable risks. But it should leave the door open to developing the kinds of technologies that might actually help us manage the risk a little better. And it should encourage that. And it should do that by not only having the act, but accompanying it with resources, with mechanisms that actually help us to focus on the kind of AI that's not laissez-faire. Let's just, have a better recommender system, no matter how intransparent it is, but that actually creates incentives, not regulatory incentives, but, financial incentives, market incentives to have systems that avoid some of the known or all of the known pitfalls. That's what I would advocate for.
Yeah, these are very interesting points. I want to just address them. First of all, I completely agree with you that good regulation is about mitigating potent, recognizable, avoidable risks. But I also think that's precisely why you need to structure things in a manner that is more narrowly defined for what it is you're actually trying to mitigate. And again, I think broad brush horizontal, too many hidden costs to do that, and it's actually quite hubristic to think we can have this sort of Archimedean position from which we can observe all the potential risks. I think this is an ongoing process, and the temptation is to create an all-encompassing legislative framework. I think that we will be surprised by the costs that it carries. The point I made this point not deeply enough in my presentation. It shouldn't just be about forbidden practices, but also about incentivizing good practices and incentivizing the development of human compatible AI and incentivizing tools like AutoML to come about. And in terms of the costs to participate in the research process, I'm very much in favor of creating systems of compute credits, creating public cloud compute. There are ways and tools in which we can make it easier for people to take part. But the first objection you raised about let's just take the example of Facebook and network effects, which is very commonly raised. It's not a new point, right? That somehow things have now changed and a new kind of monopoly is coming about where once you have the reach and scale, no one can assail you. And that's quite a departure from the traditional understanding of competition economics, where it used to be that a monopoly is natural, like in a railway, where you can't just build another track next to it. The Federal Trade Commission is currently struggling to articulate a case in the US as to why Facebook is a monopoly. And I don't have a dog in this fight, but I think I would not be surprised if in 10 years' time, or even in 5 years' time, the situation looks very different, because the internet does dramatically lower barriers to entry and make it possible for other new networks to come about. Already, Facebook use is drastically declining in under 25-year-olds who are switching to TikTok. And the proliferation of networks and platforms, I just don't think it's static. I don't think that we are going to be stuck with one company, one model. I think the whole potential of the internet economy is that the churn, if anything, speeds up. And I think that's a really interesting area to investigate further and to research further. I don't fully believe, I'm not sold on the idea that whoever is big tech now will stay big tech forever, because the same forces that gave rise to these companies, same force that allowed Microsoft to take on IBM, those forces are still with us. And I think there will always be a demand from people to buy and use new innovative products that offer something different and fresh. So I'm not as pessimistic that the economy is completely captured by these special interests. And I do still believe in the power of a free market where we can all participate to generate new options and also new sources of wealth for people. It's just a very fundamental principle, I guess, in my outlook on politics and economics.
So before closing this debate, Ms. Kuterer, do you want to add something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think it's really important, and I usually don't disagree with Ben, but there's one point where I do, and that is the horizontal versus the vertical regulation. In particular, when you're sitting on the design and development side for AI that is of general purpose, facing sectoral approaches where the obligations for the design and the development might differ enormously could actually raise the costs for development, because you would need to develop specifically or set up compliance mechanisms specifically for specific sectors. So I think there is value in having horizontal obligations that can cut across many different sectors when it comes to the development and design of responsible AI, where I would say what is eventually unfortunate with the AI Act more generally is that we are, of course, very much focused on the high risk. Well, while I do agree it was important that the Commission focuses on the known risks and the high risks that are known, and eventually has a mechanisms to amend that list over time as AI develops, it is missing a little bit the need for AI governance or responsible AI governance more broadly. There is this code of conduct tool, but maybe maybe a little bit less the strong-armed hand on the high-risk side, and more bringing this culture of responsible AI governance, both in the development and design and the deployment, would have helped to create this culture shift that we need when people interact with AI, and when governments, public sector, or enterprises start using AI that has an impact on the lives of people. So that is sort of like a little bit eventually an unbalanced piece. I just wanted to raise this as well.
Thank you, Ms. Cotterer. Since we are quite behind the schedule, sadly we cannot welcome any more questions from the audience, but we want to move to, let's say, a final question regarding the forecast made by Muller's report, and also a question, sort of open questions about the worst case scenario. So Alejandro, if you want to go ahead with the first question regarding the forecasts.
So, Mr. Muller, you recently got engaged in a discussion with Joanna Bryson, AI ethics professor, and Mary Hattajad, CEO of AI startup in Finland. They published analysis of compliance costs and feedback of the AI Act, claiming that your forecast might be exaggerating, since way too focused on the worst case scenario for compliance costs of high-risk AI systems. Do you think that globally a quality management system for a business will be in the next future, rather than an initially burdensome requirement, also an investment to mitigate growing regulatory and security risk? Or do you don't think so?
And also, sorry, before you answer, just to give a brief of context, the impact assessments made by the European Commission do forecast compliance costs around, let's say, 7,000 euros, roundabout. Bryson and Ataya, they are forecasting around 14,000, and meanwhile Muller is forecasting up to 400,000 euros. Please.
Yes. So I tried to cover some of this in my presentation. I will actually bring it up again, because obviously these are very critical points. We'll start with the general first, and then we'll get into the specifics. Any analysis of costs of something that doesn't exist yet is going to be contentious. It's just a fact, because you're talking about speculative futures. And as I explained, my effort in my analysis was more around, rather than just the actual quantifiable headline costs that will confront companies, also costs of things that will not happen, which I think will be significant on a social level. I think it was Holger who put it very eloquently. We risk, and also this actually connects to the question of, is it just going to be a global approach to a QMS system? Well, in economic terms, what's likely to happen, if it is true that the costs are very high, is that companies will develop AI elsewhere, capture the value, and then sell to the European market once they can afford to shoulder the regulation cost. And I think that would just be such a loss for our societies, for our people, and it would create a dependency that would be really dramatic, and would also slow down the shift that we are going through, where our economies and our societies become more digital. We need more of that, not less of that. We need our public services to move to the digital realm. I want to be able to file my taxes digitally. I want to be able to access public services digitally. And we need our businesses to be able to harness the potential for AI to allow them to automate processes, lower their costs, and create new opportunities to go into. The difference in the cost assessments arise from, I try to go into the unforeseen consequences and the complexity effects of a horizontal law, which I think are undervalued, dramatically undervalued, but are also hard to compute. The definition of AI, as I said, I think is extremely wide. Therefore, again, the footprint of the law will be much bigger. The assumptions in the existing analyses seem to work off the baseline that we are actually only talking about this narrowly defined advanced AI. But as we said in some readings, you're literally talking all kinds of software, and that would obviously massively multiply the amount of companies affected. And then where I'm actually most comfortable in this debate is this ongoing thing about the QMS system. If you look at this slide, this is now a quote from the SME Alliance saying that the €7,000 cost it's plucked very favorably by the Commission. They obviously have an interest in suggesting that this law won't cost anything, and it completely neglects the cost of hiring the people to, like, first of all, draft the documentation and maintain the documentation. Someone has to actually be in charge of turning the legal obligations into some kind of business case. All of that costs money, and it's going to be a lot more than €7,000 alone. The cost of qualified personnel for this stuff, not to mention the added cost of, you're going to have to take your software engineers away from product design. You're going to have to sit down with the compliance teams. So the conformity assessment compliance cost is going to be much higher. The QMS cost, the argument there relies on a disagreement around whether companies will need to build a quality management system. Because if they do need to build a quality management system, then the EU's figures themselves state it will cost up to €400,000. And again, it's a question of, do you look at things statically or dynamically? There's an argument that a lot of companies already are subject to some kind of EU conformity assessment procedure and therefore have a quality management system. I'm talking about companies that do not yet have that and want to enter the regulated space. And this is also why even the EU in its impact assessment states at the end that some stakeholders might not choose to enter the regulated market because these costs are too high. But you know, it's not about who can get at the exact right figure and who can get the number that is closest to the truth. It's about having the conversation that we're having here and having debates where these viewpoints get articulated and different trade-offs are outlined and different sort of priorities are discussed. But at least then we can honestly say this type of regulatory approach is likely to engender these kinds of costs, and vice versa. Here are some alternatives where we may get the same results at a lower cost.
That's a good point. Let us make a last general question, and then we're going to ask you for a final commentary. But anyway, we still have kind of 10 minutes. And we prepared a kind of provoking, let's say, question about a worst case scenario. Let me read like the premises, because I think it's somebody aligned like about like the, let's say, the cascade effects of the cost related to this act, sorry. So the European Union regulatory environment will drain AI investment in Europe. AI industry internationally will keep making progresses, spending more and more computational resources to get diminishing technological advancement, foremost based on the current machine learning and deep learning approaches. As an example, the training of GPT-3 by OpenAI has somehow exhausted all the human-made textual data available on the internet with dire environmental costs. Speculating on that, the current approaches will soon reach a plateau of technology improvements based solely on those architectures. Given that, this might cut off research and development costs, of current AI system, allowing to democratize a more accessible market even to small medium enterprises due to a stable growing demand for both AI architecture. Also, let's consider the benefits deriving from distributed costs of federated learning, the rising trends of data marketplaces, and the plethora of open source projects and platforms, such as, for example, TensorFlow. Thereby, as implication, we might assist to a decrease of costs related to import those AI solutions in the European Union. And what I'd like to ask to all of the panelists now is, do you think the costs will then be related to compliance modification of imported products, or way too many AI products will get banned? Do you think that the compliance costs might decrease, as somehow happened with the GDPR consultancy services? And what other economic cascade effects do you envision for the European Union in this worst case scenario? Somebody wants to start?
I'll give it a crack. So the question about AI development and the future of that, this is very difficult. It's a sort of a side project or a hobby of mine. I'm working with some friends on trying to quantitatively assess the rate of AI progress and try and extrapolate a bit to, you know, when we can expect to see certain AI milestones to take place. And the rate of progress has been very fast in the last 10 years. So looking at state-of-the-art benchmark performance, how long does it take for improvements, and how long does it take for certain benchmarks to be solved? What's interesting about this is that so much, not all, but a lot has been driven by compute, the scaling hypothesis, of which GPT-3 is an example. And at current trends, you will hit a ceiling, because if you just go from, if you go to a trillion parameters and beyond, eventually even companies like OpenAI and its funders won't be able to support that. So what's, in my view, this is very much a personal view, what I think is likely to happen or has to happen is that instead of compute carrying all the work, algorithmic innovation will come about, of the kind that we saw with the rise of neural networks, which, by the way, is an innovation from the 50s, right? We were just able to piggyback off it because the compute became accessible and cheap enough. But that won't stop. And I think the projection and prediction of how AI progress will continue in the future no one has a crystal ball. But my worry is that the compliance cost in Europe that we are adding on means that companies won't be able to do as much here as they will be able to do elsewhere. And my worry is also about smart young people moving elsewhere, where they feel like they're going to be able to do these things with less interference. And as for GDPR, absolutely, an industry has sprung up of service providers. I see the sense in GDPR. I think a good data protection framework is important for our society. I think GDPR is very rigid and forbids some very sensible things, like you can't pseudonymize data, makes it very difficult to do some kinds of healthcare research. This is why the UK is now looking at certain select specific GDPR reforms to ease the burden on some forms of research that don't undermine the actual levels of data protection. But the idea that because servicing companies exist, the cost of the law goes down reminds me of the parable of broken windows. Broken windows are great for the window maker, but there's still an overall cost to the economy. And so that's just a fallacy to bear in mind. It's not an anti-regulation argument, but we should be mindful that the costs that are spent by people on GDPR compliance is money that would go elsewhere. And GDPR could certainly be improved. I think there's no doubt that definition of legitimate interests and purpose limitation and opt-outs for automation are all done in a very heavy-handed manner. I'm sure that my fellow colleague here has alternative views.
So, well, I don't believe that the problem will be the AI evolution. The problem is that Europe has no technological sovereignty in the production of chips. So if we cannot produce the chips, we are not the owners of the machines, we will be always behind. That's one thing. So, of course, neural networks is something from the past. We have more powerful machines. We don't need companies like Amazon or Google to come. We have praise. We have more than the power all the Europeans will use in their own lives. We have there. But what happened is that we don't have companies with the size of Google to have so many researchers doing a project without the need of European money. So there is no investment, real investment in Europe to do that. And it won't be solved by small, medium enterprises. You need really now to really compete at the big level with the big players, you need thousands of big investments using all those facilities. So, and the other thing is that I don't know. I'm really always very skeptical with the use of with the cloud and the edge and all these kind of things, because someone has to pay the cost of burning CO2, and because you have the machines there and you can run epochs, it won't solve the problem. You will get a minimum increase in the performance, but really it's not an improvement, technological improvement. Where it was a fortress here was the algorithmical design, and now we are losing that because you have plenty of power to just put the machines to run and it will be solved. And that's the case. And we at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center saw the problem because we have an open competition to all over Europe. So you present projects to create new kind of problems. The problem is escalation. So once you can run 1,000 processors, now you want to get 10,000. And when you arrive to the 140,000 processors you have, now you need the double. We are now in petaflops. We have 10 petaflops. Very soon we will have almost an exaflop. Who will come with the data to run that? And we are not the largest machine. If you go to Jülich, they have huge machines. If you put the 7 machines working together, that's incredible. And you can do it. If you have the right project and you present it and the commission accepted, the commission of the European Commission, so the commission of experts accepted, you will run. But who assesses that? It's really what we are looking for. And so this idea of the free market is very nice, and we have growth, but also it has a price. You are displacing people from the competition because you cannot get into that. The universities, at least in Spain, we are suffering because Google is paying salaries of 6 or 7 figures that we cannot pay. Microsoft is opening a new placement in Barcelona, 100 engineers, and they will destroy the market because destroy in good sense. They will get the best people because they will pay more than universities and local companies will do. And we had Yahoo in the past, and it's clear that Google will come to Barcelona soon. So the universities will be just a dessert. Only old people like me will stay at the university because all youngs will want to have the appropriate CV to be there. So you will create some products, but the ownership won't be yours. So that's something that we have to think about. So who has the IP on all that? At the end, if we don't have chips, even if you have the best technology, algorithm technology, when you put it in your airplanes or in your autonomous cars, the day they want to just not selling the chips, they will stop there. And we are seeing what happened when Europe is not investing in foundries. All our automotive industries stop it because there is no chips. So we have to rethink a little. Maybe too much focus on AI. That's very good because it's our field, and I have certain age, and I saw in the past few winters, and winter is coming again. It's not Netflix announcement.
So perhaps I would be allowed to respond to this, or is that not a good time?
Yeah, I can see the chat. So that's
yeah, Mr. Paus, do you want to interact with us now?
Yeah, I think that would be good. You know, I'm an optimist. At the same time, I'm with Ulysses when he says, you know, winter is coming in a sense. Actually, it's this time of the year where we can feel this, right? But I think the winter that's coming for us is of a very different nature. I don't think it's really AI coming. It's not AI running out of steam. I think it's the kind of winter that we created by running out of you know, control with human intelligence and messing up our environment badly enough that year after year we will now see sort of, you know, rising costs of our inability to understand and predict and responsibly use the one system that we are all critically dependent on, and this is our planet, right? And so I think the real problem with the free market, as much as I believe in it as well, is that it has unfortunately sort of built-in incentives for a relatively short horizon. And, you know, I'm not saying this as an AI researcher now, where a short horizon might be something like even 6 months or a year, but I'm saying it perhaps more on a political scale, where a short horizon would be 2 years or 4 years, or the scale at which the current disasters are unfolding and locking themselves in ever more deeply, right? So I think what we all need, what humanity really needs, is more work that is trying to be responsible on the 10 to 15 to 30 to 50 to 100 year horizon. And to be honest with you, I don't believe industry alone will do this, because that's not what shareholder value incentivizes industry to do, and we can't even blame them for it. Even for politicians, this is very hard, because if they look at that horizon and make trade-offs, right, they very, very easily risk not getting re-elected. So this is a much deeper crisis and problem, right? So now we get to AI. Here, I think AI can be and needs to be a massive part of the solution, right? Because our own limitations of thinking near the edge, and I'm not talking about the edge as an edge computing, but the edge where we bump just enough into the limits of our resources, but have just enough capability to mess things up in subtle and bad ways that have long-term consequences that are difficult to sort out, right? Unfortunately, we've reached that point kind of simultaneously, right? And what that really means is that if we want to extricate ourselves, we have to give it everything we have. And what we have as humans is not enough. What we need is to extend our intelligence in ways that actually are very difficult for humans. And this is where AI really comes in. So now a very brief remark about neural networks. It's right that they have been around since the 50s, but I actually don't buy at all the argument that the main limiting factor has been the lack of data and compute, right? Because it's also algorithmic improvements that have happened in the 2000s, and more than anything else, there has been a culture of AI winter that wasn't just a culture of AI winter, but in the summer that preceded it, that just neglected, and I think almost criminally neglected, an entire area of AI, and neural networks fell into that. So it's not so easy to just blame it on technology. It is human culture that kind of really held back developments in neural networks for far too long. And then, of course, there was lots of easy pickings, especially once it was also boosted by, a lot of fast machines, a lot of bright minds gravitating to that, and so on. I think it's clear that neural networks will hit a limit. I think we're starting to see this, a limit of compute, a limit of data, and also a limit of algorithms. That has happened in AI over and over and over again. And maybe they will, they will continue to be useful. Maybe they will dominate again in the future in certain areas. I like to believe that this is the case, but we should not bet everything on one technology. Whenever we've done that in AI, we've actually made we've made big mistakes, big and costly mistakes. We should hedge these bets, right? And especially when it comes to the kind of machine learning technology that dominates right now, it's solving actually problems that can be, in a sense, brute force to a large extent, right? But the problems that we really have are of a different nature. And these are of a nature where humans, when they solve them, have to actually combine brute forcing with rather clever knowledge-based ideas. And if I were to make a bet, I would think that this is where the journey is going, right? Especially if we talk about trustworthy AI. The trustworthiness that guarantees the robustness will, in my opinion, almost certainly involve elements of automated reasoning, knowledge representation, and areas of AI that now the most extreme people in neural networks say, well, this is old-fashioned AI, we should just do away with it. Soon we will do everything with neural networks. That isn't the thinking that's helping us. We need to put everything that we have to the task that we want to resolve. And now finally, who should actually do this? As I said, I think industry, certainly will contribute. I very much hope so, but they're not correctly incentivized. Maybe even politics isn't. But what I do see, and this makes me really optimistic, is in young people increasingly a tendency that says, you know what, whether I have a 6 or 7 figure salary, that doesn't matter to me personally. I want to do something that I can be proud of, right? And proud of not in terms of, whatever, a NeurIPS plenary presentation every year, but proud of in terms of I can tell everyone, I can tell my family that this is what I'm doing and this is why it's valuable, not just in terms of a euro or dollar figure. I see more and more young people like that. And I think what we need to do is create opportunities for them, right? And industry will do this in part, and I say yay for them. But again, they shouldn't be the only ones doing that. And that is where well-resourced public institutions can make a big difference. And here I want to end by just saying, when we were at the threshold of being able to sequence the human genome, it was correctly predicted that this was so fundamental, so important, that just letting history run its course and have the one company that had the capability completed and then sort of have the rewards, right, was unacceptable. And there was a huge public effort and it was done essentially simultaneously. I think that's exactly what needs to happen now. And I don't see this big public effort happening anywhere. I certainly don't see it happening in the States. I don't think it's going to happen in China, at least not in the way that we need and want it. So I think this is where Europe has to step up. And regulation might be a small part of it, but it's actually only the smallest part. So my hope is, in closing, that we can look past regulation and that we can look at where we really want to be going. And then, yes, there should probably be some regulatory constraints and encouragement to go in this direction and to protect our citizenry. But there should also be strong incentives, like Ben said before, in the public sector to compete with what otherwise will be necessarily dominated big time by industry whose natural interests are very short term, which is very much misaligned with what we all need. Thank you.
Ms. Kitterer, do you want to add something else as a final thought?
Yes, I think, a lot of things have been said that would require us probably another 3 hours to sit together and discuss these topics. So I hope that we have the opportunity at one point to do so. First of all, I want to, sometimes when I hear this big tech bashing, I will say that I become a little bit cynical insofar as the attempts to target big tech in regulation often actually don't hurt big tech. We have seen this over and over in some of the discussions around cookies and GDPR and the follow-ups that are now happening in using privacy to to potentially bolster a specific sphere. So I think that needs to be much more nuanced, and it needs to be much more nuanced in terms of, you know, what is actually harmful in certain areas. Is it the size of a company, or is it the business model that might have a specific impact? And so in all occasions, being nuanced about understanding the problem that we're trying to solve, and potentially the triggers of the problem would be really, really helpful in this discussion. And then I do actually believe that often big companies can be good partners to the public sector in advancing certain policies and objectives. And that you can see certainly in the context of sustainability and corporate responsibility, and bigger companies, not only in the tech sector, really advancing how to become more sustainable in their operations, in their value chain. In the context of AI and the fundamental rights that we have been discussing a little bit at least, there is a lot of discussions and around human rights due diligence, and companies like Microsoft have long committed to those obligations that have been established under the UN guidance for corporate business operations. And even in the European Union, there's a bigger discussion about human rights due diligence obligations, and potentially we'll see by the end of this year still a law that will enact that. So, and that just shows that it's a next step, but clearly the public sector has you know, that they don't need laws to act responsible. They have this obligation through the Fundamental Rights Charter directly. So I think there has been there needs to be more nuances when we are talking about what is the role of specific actors. We should rather think how can they actually help advancing those discussions. That's just for the little piece of the end of the discussion that we are just having. And as I said, this requires probably even a longer discussion in how these pieces fit together. But I just wanted to mark that these general, very political pieces are not necessarily helpful in achieving, I think, where we all agree to actually make AI trustworthy and put guardrails against uses that are not in the interest of society. And here I would say again, to Holger's point, it's actually in our interest as a responsible corporate entity to have these guardrails in place, precisely for the fact that we are not entering into a race to the bottom by having these guardrails. So there is, for entities and companies that want to do it right, those guardrails are actually quite helpful. And if you like, in the shareholder values interest. So again, you can look at it from a different perspective, and I think I just want to raise this because this is I think important to the debate. And I stop here.
So thank you to Mr. Haas and Ms. Cutter. And I think that we are running out of time, but like the debate could go on for a really long time. So let us thank you once again for dedicating your interest to this panel. And we hope that the panelists' contribution would have provided strong insights for the audience, as well as for future discussions concerning the new European AI Acts. And have a good evening.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yes.
Wonderful
Thank
to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Hope to see a debate with Bryson one day, and you. I would be really curious to see the outcomes.
Might even happen.